Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you look at your next beer very differently. We're going back to a time when beer wasn't just a drink. It was currency, medicine, religious offering, and the liquid that literally built the pyramids. Imagine a world where your daily wages were paid in beer, where children drank beer for breakfast, and where brewing was so sacred that it had its own goddess with prayers that doubled as recipes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Are you having a beer right now? After tonight, you'll never look at it the same way. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because we're about to discover that beer is older than writing, older than the wheel, possibly older than agriculture itself. We'll meet Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer whose hymn is the oldest surviving beer recipe. We'll stand with the pyramid builders, receiving their daily beer rations. And we'll uncover how this simple fermented drink shaped civilization in ways you never imagined. Part 1. The Divine Origins. Ninkasi and the First Recipe. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 1800 BCE, someone carved into clay tablets what might be the most important recipe in human history. But this wasn't just instructions for making beer. It was a hymn to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of brewing. This sacred song, sung by brewers for generations, contains within its verses the oldest surviving beer recipe, a perfect fusion of the practical and the divine that tells us everything about how ancient peoples viewed this transformative drink. The hymn to Ninkasi begins not with measurements or techniques, but with the goddess's birth, born of the flowing water, tenderly cared for by the Ninkasi. Ninkasi wasn't some minor deity relegated to the pantheon's edges. She was essential, born from the primordial waters themselves, nurtured by the mother goddess. Her very existence was tied to the fundamental forces of creation, because, in the Sumerian mind, beer was that important. Ninkasi, you are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. The waves rise. The waves fall. This isn't metaphorical. It's describing the malting process, where barley is soaked in water to begin germination, the first crucial step in brewing. The waves refer to the way the grain swells and moves as it absorbs water. What makes this hymn remarkable is that it served dual purposes. For the literate priesthood, it was a religious text, a prayer to ensure successful brewing. But for the countless illiterate brewers, mostly women in Sumerian society, it was a mnemonic device. The rhythm and repetition of the hymn helped them remember the complex, multi-day process of turning grain into beer. Sing the hymn, follow its steps, and you'll produce beer worthy of the gods. The process described in the hymn is surprisingly sophisticated. It mentions bapir, a type of barley bread that was baked twice, similar to modern biscotti. This bread wasn't for eating. It was specifically for brewing. The double baking created enzymes that would help convert starches to sugars during fermentation. The hymn describes mixing this bapir with malted barley and water, creating a mash that would ferment into beer. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. Coolness overcomes, the hymn continues. This line describes the cooling process, essential for adding yeast without killing it. The Sumerians didn't understand microorganisms, but they knew that the magic of fermentation only happened within certain temperature ranges. The large reed mats increased surface area for faster cooling, a technique that wouldn't look out of place in a modern craft brewery. The social context of the hymn reveals even more. When you pour out the filtered beer of the collector vat, it is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. This wasn't just poetic flourish. The comparison to Mesopotamia's life-giving rivers emphasized beer's essential role in society. Just as the rivers brought fertility to the land, beer brought health, happiness, and social cohesion to the people. The Mesopotamian brewing industry. Beyond the religious aspects, Mesopotamian brewing was a massive industry that shaped the entire economy. Every household brewed beer, but there were also commercial breweries, some quite large. The Code of Hammurabi, dating from around 1750 BCE, contains several laws specifically about beer and taverns, showing how regulated and important the industry was. Tavern keepers who overcharged for beer could be drowned. If a priestess entered a tavern, she could be burned alive, showing the complex relationship between religious propriety and alcohol consumption. If conspirators met in a tavern and the owner didn't report them, the owner faced execution. Beer wasn't just business. It was politics, religion, and social control all fermented together. The variety of beers produced in Mesopotamia was astounding. Texts mention at least 20 different types, categorized by color, strength, filtering method, and additives. There was golden beer, dark beer, sweet dark beer, red beer, and beer with a head. Some beers were filtered. Others were drunk through straws to avoid the floating barley husks. Strengths varied from weak small beers, suitable for children, to strong ceremonial brews that could induce religious visions. The terminology around beer was remarkably specific. Different words existed for fresh beer versus aged beer, for beer at various stages of fermentation, for the foam on top of beer, even for the specific sound beer makes when fermenting. This linguistic richness shows how central beer was to daily life. When you have dozens of words for something, it's because that thing matters deeply to your culture. Women dominated the brewing industry in early Mesopotamia. The connection between Ninkasi and female brewers wasn't coincidental. Brewing was seen as an extension of bread-making and cooking, traditional female domains. The most successful brewers could achieve significant social status and wealth. Tavern-owning women appear in legal documents as property owners, moneylenders, and witnesses to important contracts. But this female dominance wouldn't last. As brewing became more commercialized and profitable, men increasingly took control of the industry. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian period, most commercial brewers were men, though women continued to brew for household consumption. This pattern, women innovating and maintaining traditions, men commercializing and controlling one's profit potential, becomes clear, repeats throughout history. The chemistry of ancient beer. What the ancients achieved through trial, error, and divine inspiration, we now understand through chemistry and microbiology. But understanding the science makes their achievements. Without thermometers, microscopes, or any understanding of fermentation, they created complex biochemical processes that we still use today. The malting process described in the hymn to Ninkasi is biochemically sophisticated. When barley germinates, it produces enzymes, particularly amylase, that convert the grain's starches into fermentable sugars. The ancients didn't know about enzymes, but they knew that sprouted grain made better beer than unsprouted. They learned to control germination by soaking and drying the grain at specific intervals, creating what we now call malt. The bapir bread mentioned in the hymn served multiple purposes. The baking process gelatinized starches, making them more accessible to enzymes. It also created Maillard reactions, the same chemical process that browns toast or roasts coffee, adding color and complex flavors to the beer. The twice baking concentrated these flavors and created a stable product that could be stored and transported, essentially an ancient form of malt extract. Fermentation in ancient times relied on wild yeasts present in the environment. Brewers didn't add yeast. They created conditions where naturally occurring yeasts would thrive. Certain pottery vessels became preferred for fermentation because they harbored yeast colonies in their porous walls. These vessels were treasured, passed down through generations, never washed with anything that might kill the mysterious force that turned sweet liquid into beer. The alcohol content of ancient beer varied widely but was generally lower than modern beer. Most everyday beer was probably 2 to 3% alcohol, making it safer than water while still allowing people to function. Stronger ceremonial or medicinal beers might reach 7 to 8% alcohol. The low alcohol content, combined with the calories from residual sugars and proteins, made beer more of a food than an intoxicant. Temperature control, crucial for fermentation, was achieved through architectural design. Brewing rooms were often partially underground, using the Earth's thermal mass to maintain steady temperatures. In hot climates, evaporative cooling from wet reed mats helped prevent fermentation from proceeding too quickly. Winter brewing produced different flavors than summer brewing, and skilled brewers learned to use seasonal temperature variations to their advantage. The reality was far different and far more interesting. The pyramid builders were skilled workers, relatively well paid, and they were paid primarily in beer. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of humanity's most enduring achievements, was literally built on beer. The workers who constructed the pyramids weren't slaves, but rotating teams of skilled laborers and conscripted farmers working during the Nile's flood season, when agricultural work was impossible. These workers received substantial rations, carefully recorded in hieroglyphic texts. The standard daily ration included 10 loaves of bread and anywhere from 1/3 to 2 full jugs of beer, depending on the worker's position and the difficulty of their work. Let's put this in perspective. A construction crew of 20,000 workers, a conservative estimate for pyramid construction, would consume 40,000 to 60,000 jugs of beer daily. That's roughly 50,000 gallons of beer every single day, requiring an entire industrial complex just to keep the workers supplied. The logistics of producing, storing, and distributing this much beer were as complex as the pyramid construction itself. Archaeological evidence from the workers' village at Giza reveals extensive brewing facilities. Massive pottery vats for fermentation, grinding stones for processing grain, and storage areas for both ingredients and finished beer have been excavated. The brewing operation was so large that it had its own bakeries attached. The spent grain from brewing was recycled into bread, creating an efficient food production system that minimized waste. The beer provided to pyramid workers wasn't just about nutrition or hydration. It served multiple crucial functions. The alcohol, though low, helped purify water in an age before water treatment. The fermentation process increased the bioavailability of nutrients, essentially creating a liquid bread enriched with B vitamins from the yeast. The calories from alcohol and residual sugars provided energy for heavy labor. And perhaps most importantly, beer served as a social lubricant, helping maintain morale among workers far from home. Different grades of beer corresponded to different ranks of workers. Supervisors and skilled craftsmen received sweet beer, made with more grain and sometimes flavored with dates or honey. Common laborers got small beer, thinner and less alcoholic but still nutritious. The highest quality beer was reserved for religious ceremonies and offerings to the dead workers, ensuring their spirits were properly supplied in the afterlife. Egyptian brewing techniques were remarkably sophisticated, representing thousands of years of refinement. Unlike Mesopotamian beer, which was often thick and drunk through straws, Egyptian beer was typically filtered and could be quite clear. They had developed techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern brewing. The process began with malting. similar to Mesopotamian methods but with Egyptian innovations. They discovered that different malting times and temperatures produced different flavors. Lightly malted barley gave a sweet, mild beer. Heavily roasted malt produced darker, more complex flavors. They even developed a form of smoked malt by drying grain over fires, adding another dimension to their beer's flavor profile. Egyptian brewers used a two-stage fermentation process. The first fermentation was vigorous, taking place in open vats where wild yeasts could easily access the sweet wort. After a few days, the beer was transferred to sealed jars for secondary fermentation. This transfer left behind much of the sediment and dead yeast, resulting in a clearer product. It also allowed for better control of the final alcohol content and carbonation level. The Egyptians understood that different waters produced different beers. Texts mention bringing water from specific wells or river locations for brewing. While they didn't understand water chemistry, they recognized that water from certain sources made better beer. They even developed primitive water treatment methods, letting water stand in the sun or filtering it through sand and charcoal. Temperature control in the Egyptian desert required ingenuity. Brewing facilities were often built with thick walls and small windows to insulate against heat. Underground storage areas maintained cooler temperatures for fermentation and storage. During the hottest months, brewing might be done at night when temperatures were lower. Some breweries used evaporative cooling systems, with water dripping over porous pottery to cool fermentation vessels. The Egyptians were probably the first to add flavorings beyond the basic grain. Dates were common, adding sweetness and their own fermentable sugars. Honey was used for special occasions, creating a hybrid beer mead. Various herbs and spices were added for flavor and medicinal properties. Mandrake, despite its dangerous psychoactive properties, was sometimes. Blue lotus flowers, with their mild psychoactive effects, were used in religious brewing. The social hierarchy of Egyptian beer. Beer in ancient Egypt wasn't just stratified by quality, it was deeply embedded in the social structure. The type of beer you drank, where you drank it, and who you drank it with, all signaled your place in society. At the top of the pyramid, literally and figuratively, was the pharaoh. Royal breweries produced beers of extraordinary quality, using the finest ingredients and most skilled brewers. These beers were often aged, something rare in the ancient world. Special brewing vessels made of gold or silver were used for royal beer, as metal was believed to impart beneficial properties to the brew. The priesthood had their own brewing traditions. Temple breweries produced beer for religious ceremonies, offerings to the gods, and daily consumption by priests. These beers often contained special ingredients believed to facilitate communication with the divine. The recipes were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of temple brewers. The military received standardized beer rations, with officers getting better quality and quantity than common soldiers. Military beer was often stronger than civilian beer, liquid courage for those who might face death in battle. Special fortified beers were brewed for long campaigns, with higher alcohol content to prevent spoilage and additions of herbs believed to prevent disease. Merchants and craftsmen could afford commercial beer from taverns and beer shops. These establishments ranged from respectable businesses, serving quality products, to sketchy dives where the beer might be watered down or adulterated. The quality of beer available in a neighborhood was a good indicator of its economic status. Farmers and laborers often brewed their own beer or received it as payment for work. This homebrew varied wildly in quality depending on the skill of the brewer and available ingredients. During harvest time, when grain was plentiful, even poor families might enjoy good beer. During lean times, they made do with thin, barely alcoholic brews made from whatever grain they could spare. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a commodity, it was currency. Workers were paid in beer, taxes were collected in beer, and debts were settled in beer. This beer economy reveals fascinating details about ancient Egyptian life and economics. The standardization of beer as currency required quality control and measurement standards. Official beer inspectors ensured that beer used for payment met minimum standards. Vessels were standardized so that a jar of beer meant the same thing throughout Egypt. Fraud, watering down beer, or using inferior ingredients, was severely punished, sometimes by death. The exchange rate between beer and other commodities was surprisingly stable. Texts from Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, show that a jar of ordinary beer was worth about 1/5 of a deben of copper. A pair of sandals cost about 2 jars of beer. A simple tunic might cost 5 jars. These prices remained relatively constant for centuries, showing beer's stability as a currency. Beer wages created interesting economic dynamics. Unlike grain, which could be stored indefinitely, beer had a limited shelf life. This encouraged consumption and prevented excessive wealth accumulation. It also meant that workers needed regular employment. You couldn't save up beer wages for lean times like you could with grain or metal currency. The beer economy also created opportunities for entrepreneurship. Skilled home brewers could produce surplus beer to trade for other goods. Tavern keeping was one of the few businesses women could own and operate independently. Some women became wealthy through brewing, owning property, and even lending beer at interest. International trade in beer was limited but significant. Egyptian beer was exported to Nubia, the Levant, and occasionally even to Mesopotamia. These exports were usually high quality, specially brewed beers that could survive long journeys. Importing beer was rare, but did occur Mesopotamian date beers, and Syrian specialty brews occasionally appeared in Egyptian markets. It was central to mythology, essential to rituals, and believed to have transformative spiritual properties. The boundaries between sacred and profane drinking were blurry and constantly negotiated. The goddess Hathor, deity of joy, music, and drunkenness, was closely associated with beer. Her festivals, particularly the Festival of Drunkenness, involved ritual intoxication. Participants would drink beer mixed with herbs that enhanced its psychoactive effects, dancing and singing, until they achieved a state of divine ecstasy. These weren't debauched parties, but carefully orchestrated religious experiences designed to bring participants closer to the divine. The myth of Sekhmet and the saving of humanity revolves around beer. When Ra decided to destroy humanity, he sent the lioness goddess Sekhmet to slaughter them. She became so bloodthirsty that Ra feared she would kill everyone. To stop her, he had beer dyed red to look like blood and poured it across the land. Sekhmet drank it, became drunk, and forgot about her mission of destruction. This myth was reenacted annually, with participants drinking red beer to commemorate humanity's salvation through divine intoxication. Funerary practices involved extensive use of beer. The deceased were buried with jars of beer for their journey through the afterlife. Tomb paintings show the dead drinking beer in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. During the opening of the mouth ceremony, which reanimated the mummy for the afterlife, beer was one of the substances used to restore the deceased's senses. Medical texts prescribed beer for various ailments. Beer was used as a base for medicines, its alcohol extracting active compounds from herbs. Different beers were prescribed for different conditions: sweet beer for coughs, bitter beer for digestive issues, strong beer for pain relief. One medical papyrus contains over 100 remedies using beer as a primary ingredient. The production of ritual beer followed strict protocols. Brewers had to be ritually pure, abstaining from sex and certain foods before brewing. The water had to be blessed, the grain consecrated. The fermentation process was accompanied by prayers and offerings. Any deviation from the prescribed process could anger the gods and render the beer spiritually polluted. Let's follow a day in the life of Merit, a professional brewer in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina around 1250 BCE during the reign of Ramesses II. Merit wakes before dawn in her small but comfortable house. As one of the village's master brewers, she enjoys respect and relative prosperity. Her husband is a tomb painter, but her income from brewing often exceeds his. She owns her own brewing equipment, inherited from her mother who was also a brewer, and has 2 apprentices learning the trade. Her day begins with checking the fermentation vessels from yesterday's batch. The ceramic jars are warm to the touch, and she can hear the gentle bubbling of active fermentation. The smell, yeasty, sweet, with hints of date, tells her the fermentation is proceeding well. She tastes a small amount, noting the balance of sweetness and alcohol, deciding this batch needs 1 more day before it's ready. Next, she begins preparing a new batch. Today, she's making standard workers' beer, the everyday drink that keeps the village functioning. She starts by checking her grain. The barley has been malting for 3 days, and the small shoots indicate it's ready. She spreads it on the flat roof of her brewing shed to dry in the morning sun, knowing that by afternoon it will be ready for grinding. Her apprentices arrive and begin grinding yesterday's dried malt using a stone quern. It's hard work, and they take turns, singing work songs that help maintain rhythm and pass the time. Merit supervises, checking the consistency of the ground grain. Too fine, and it will make cloudy beer. Too coarse, and fermentation will be slow. While the apprentices grind, Merit prepares her special ingredient, dates from her cousin's farm in the Fayum oasis. These aren't just any dates, but a specific variety known for fermenting well. She removes the pits and chops them finely, knowing that the fruit sugars will boost the alcohol content and add complexity to the flavor. The mashing process requires precise timing. Merit heats water in a large ceramic vessel, using dried dung as fuel. Wood is too precious in the desert. She knows exactly how hot the water should be by how it feels on her wrist, a technique taught by her mother. Too hot, and it will destroy the grain's enzymes. Too cool, and extraction will be incomplete. The mixture must be kept at the right temperature for the time it takes to recite certain prayers. Her method of timing without clocks. She adds the chopped dates halfway through, their sweetness balancing the grain's earthiness. After mashing, the liquid must be separated from the spent grain. Merit uses a clever system of pottery vessels with perforated false bottoms, essentially an ancient lauterton. The sweet liquid, called wort by modern brewers, though Merit knows it by another name, flows into collection vessels while the grain is retained. This spent grain won't be wasted. It will be dried and used for animal feed or mixed into bread dough. The wort must be cooled before fermentation can begin. Merit transfers it to shallow ceramic pans, maximizing surface area for faster cooling. While waiting, she prepares her fermentation vessels. Aren't cleaned in the modern sense. That would destroy the wild yeast colonies living in the pottery's pores. Instead, she rinses them with a small amount of beer from a successful previous batch, ensuring the right yeasts dominate. The science and art of ancient fermentation. The fermentation process in ancient Egypt was both more complex and more reliable than we might expect. Without understanding microbiology, Egyptian brewers had developed techniques that consistently produced good beer, managing wild fermentation in ways that even modern brewers find impressive. The key was the fermentation vessels themselves. Egyptian brewers used specific types of pottery that became inoculated with desirable yeast strains. These vessels were never fully cleaned, allowing yeast colonies to establish themselves in the porous ceramic. Over time, each brewery developed its own unique yeast culture, giving their beer distinctive flavors. Temperature control during fermentation was achieved through architectural design and careful timing. Fermentation rooms were often partially underground, using the Earth's constant temperature to moderate the desert's extreme heat. Brewers learned to adjust their techniques seasonally, using less grain in summer when fermentation was faster, more in winter when it was slower. They knew that beer fermented near bread ovens was often superior, though they didn't understand that bread yeast was cross-contaminating their brews. They knew that vessels used for date wine could be repurposed for beer with excellent results, not realizing they were introducing different yeast strains. Some breweries had developed primitive quality control methods. They would keep a mother batch of particularly good beer, using small amounts to inoculate new batches. This technique, similar to sourdough starter maintenance, helped maintain consistency across batches. Brewers who produced exceptionally good beer could sell their starter cultures to others, creating a primitive biotechnology trade. The alcohol content of Egyptian beer varied more than previously thought, while everyday beer was indeed low in alcohol. Analysis of residues from sealed jars shows that some ceremonial or medical beers reached 10% alcohol or higher. These strong beers required special techniques, possibly including freezing concentration or multiple fermentation stages. The Egyptians also understood aging, at least for special beers. Sealed jars of beer have been found in tombs, with dates indicating they were aged for months or even years before burial. This aged beer was considered superior, smoother, and more potent. The ability to age beer successfully required careful sealing techniques and possibly higher alcohol content to prevent spoilage. Beer and medicine in ancient Egypt. The medical uses of beer in ancient Egypt were extensive and sophisticated. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts known, contains over 700 remedies, and beer appears in nearly a quarter of them. This wasn't primitive superstition, but often effective medicine based on centuries of observation. Beer served as an excellent vehicle for administering medicines. The alcohol extracted active compounds from herbs more effectively than water. The fermentation process could modify or enhance certain medicinal compounds. The beer itself provided calories and hydration to sick patients who might not be able to eat solid food. For digestive issues, beer made with specific herbs like coriander or cumin was prescribed. For pain relief, strong beer mixed with willow bark containing salicin, the precursor to aspirin, was effective. For wound treatment, beer was used to clean injuries, its alcohol content providing antiseptic properties. Mental health treatments often involved beer. Depression was treated with beer containing St. John's wort and other mood-affecting herbs. Anxiety might be addressed with beer mixed with chamomile or valerian. The texts recognize that while beer could treat mental distress, excessive consumption could cause it, showing a nuanced understanding of alcohol's effects. Gynecological medicine made extensive use of beer. Pregnant women were given special nutritious beers enriched with dates and honey. During labor, strong beer served as both pain relief and relaxation aid. Postpartum, new mothers drank beer believed to increase milk production. Some contraceptive methods involved vaginal suppositories made with beer and crocodile dung, though the effectiveness of such methods is questionable. The medical beer preparations required specialized knowledge. Medical brewers, often attached to temples of healing gods like Imhotep, underwent extensive training. They learned not just brewing, but also herb identification, preparation methods, and diagnosis. These medical brewers occupied a unique position between medicine and manufacturing, international beer trade, and diplomacy. While beer was primarily a local product in the ancient world, international trade and diplomatic exchange of beer did occur, revealing fascinating connections between ancient civilizations. Egyptian beer occasionally appears in archaeological sites far from the Nile. Sealed jars with hieroglyphic inscriptions have been found in Nubian tombs, Canaanite cities, and even Mycenaean Greece. These weren't bulk trade goods but prestigious items, gifts between rulers or offerings at international shrines. Diplomatic correspondence mentions beer exchanges. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, include requests for Egyptian beer from foreign rulers. One letter from the king of Al-Ashir, Cyprus, specifically asks for sweet beer of Egypt as. These requests suggest Egyptian beer had an international reputation for quality. The most interesting beer diplomacy involved Nubia. The Egyptians established breweries in Nubian territories they controlled, not just to supply their garrisons, but as tools of cultural influence. By introducing Egyptian-style beer and brewing techniques, they hoped to Egyptianize the local population. The strategy partially worked. Nubian elite adopted Egyptian beer customs while maintaining their own brewing traditions. Trade in brewing knowledge was perhaps more significant than trade in beer itself. Egyptian brewers were sometimes sent to foreign courts as specialists. A tomb inscription mentions a brewer who spent 3 years at the Mitanni court teaching Egyptian brewing methods. Conversely, foreign brewing techniques influenced Egyptian practice. Syrian herbs and Mesopotamian date preparations were incorporated into Egyptian brewing. Maritime trade created unique challenges for beer transport. Ships carrying beer had to protect it from heat and motion. Special shipping jars with narrow necks and sealed tops were developed. Some ships had dedicated beer holds with insulation and ventilation. Despite these precautions, much beer spoiled during transport, making successfully delivered foreign beer especially valuable. The decline and transformation of ancient brewing. The traditional Egyptian brewing industry, that had remained largely unchanged for 3 millennia, began to transform during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek influence introduced new ideas about alcohol and consumption. The Greeks brought wine culture to Egypt. While Egyptians had always made wine, it was a luxury product. Greek colonists and administrators preferred wine and looked down on beer as barbaric. This created a cultural divide. Native Egyptians continued drinking beer, while Hellenized elites increasingly chose wine. Breweries began producing hybrid products, beers flavored to taste more like wine, to appeal to changing tastes. Roman conquest accelerated these changes. Roman soldiers received wine rations, not beer, creating new distribution networks for wine while disrupting traditional beer supply chains. Many traditional brewing families were forced out of business or converted to winemaking. Christianity brought another transformation. While early Egyptian Christians continued brewing traditions, later Byzantine influences discouraged beer consumption. Wine became associated with communion and religious ceremony, while beer was increasingly seen as pagan. Monasteries that had been centers of brewing knowledge converted to wine production. The Islamic conquest might have been expected to end Egyptian alcohol production entirely, but the reality was more complex. While alcohol was forbidden to Muslims, Christian and Jewish communities continued brewing. Beer production went underground in some areas, produced secretly for medicinal purposes or for non-Muslim minorities. Traditional brewing knowledge was preserved in Coptic Christian communities. The techniques and knowledge of ancient Egyptian brewing didn't disappear, but transformed and dispersed. Medieval European brewing inherited much from Egyptian tradition transmitted through Roman and Byzantine sources. The use of herbs and spices in beer, the understanding of malting, even some fermentation techniques can be traced back to Egyptian origins. Modern rediscovery of ancient beers. In recent decades, archaeologists and brewers have collaborated to recreate ancient beers, providing insights into both ancient technology and culture. These projects have revealed that ancient beers were far more sophisticated than previously believed. The most famous recreation project was Anchor Brewing's collaboration with archaeologists to brew Ninkasi, based on the hymn to Ninkasi. The project required extensive research into ancient ingredients and techniques. The brewers had to source emmer wheat, an ancient grain rarely grown today. They baked babir bread according to descriptions in the hymn. The resulting beer was unlike anything modern, thick, sweet, slightly sour, with complex fruit and bread flavors. Egyptian beer recreations have been even more revealing. Analysis of residues from ancient pottery using modern chemical techniques has identified ingredients and fermentation products. One project analyzing beer jars from Hierakonpolis found evidence of a complex recipe including emmer wheat, barley, dates, and psychoactive herbs. The recreation of this. Dr. Patrick M.C. Govan, known as the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, has pioneered biomolecular archaeology of ancient alcoholic beverages. His analysis of Egyptian vessels revealed sophisticated brewing, including the use of wild herbs for flavoring and preservation, calcium-rich water to enhance enzyme activity, and even evidence of primitive hop-like bittering agents. Modern craft brewers have embraced ancient techniques. Several breweries now produce ancient ales using historical recipes and methods. These beers challenge modern assumptions about what beer should taste like. They're often sour from wild fermentation, sweet from dates or honey, and herbaceous from ancient flavoring plants. While they might not appeal to all modern palates, they provide a tangible connection to our ancestors. The recreation projects have also revealed practical knowledge. Ancient brewers understood concepts we've only recently rediscovered. The use of mixed fermentation with multiple yeast strains, now trendy in craft brewing, was standard in ancient times. The practice of aging beer in ceramic vessels, which modern brewers are exploring for flavor development, was common in ancient Egypt. The social revolution of ancient beer. Beer's impact on ancient society went far beyond nutrition or intoxication. It fundamentally shaped how humans organized themselves, interacted, and built civilizations. The need to produce beer may have been one of the driving forces behind the agricultural revolution itself. The beer before bread hypothesis suggests that the desire to brew beer, not bake bread, motivated early grain cultivation. Wild grains were difficult to process into bread, but relatively easy to brew into beer. The psychoactive and social effects of alcohol provided immediate motivation for cultivation. The nutritional benefits were secondary to the social and spiritual experiences beer enabled. Beer production required unprecedented cooperation. Unlike hunting or gathering, which could be done by individuals or small groups, brewing required coordinated effort. Grain had to be grown, harvested, and processed. Water sources had to be controlled. Fermentation had to be managed. This cooperation fostered the development of complex societies. Brewing vessels were too large and fragile to move frequently. Grain storage required permanent structures. The investment in brewing infrastructure tied people to specific locations, contributing to the development of villages and eventually cities. Beer facilitated trade networks. Different regions produced different styles based on local ingredients and techniques. The desire for variety in beer drove early trade. The standardization required for beer as currency promoted mathematical and writing systems. Some of the earliest written records are brewing receipts and quality control documents. The communal consumption of beer created social bonds that held early societies together. Shared intoxication broke down social barriers and built trust. Religious ceremonies centered on beer created shared spiritual experiences. The tavern became a social institution where information was exchanged, deals were made, and communities were forged. Women and the ancient brewing tradition. Throughout most of ancient history, brewing was women's work. This wasn't coincidental, but reflected deep cultural beliefs about fermentation, creation, and the feminine divine. The transformation of women's role in brewing tells us much about changing social structures and gender relations. In Mesopotamia, the connection between women and brewing was explicit. Ninkasi was female, as were most brewing deities. The Sumerian word for brewer was feminine by default, requiring modification to indicate a male brewer. Tavern keeping was one of the few independent professions available to women. Successful female brewers could achieve significant wealth and social status. Egyptian brewing showed similar patterns. While both men and women brewed, commercial brewing was dominated by women. Tomb paintings show women at every stage of the brewing process. Female brewers appear in legal documents as property owners, employers, and witnesses. The association between fertility goddesses and brewing reinforced women's role in fermentation. Women created life through pregnancy, bread through baking, and beer through brewing. All mysterious transformations that men couldn't fully participate in. The monthly cycle of women was seen as connected to the fermentation cycle. Some cultures believed only women could successfully manage fermentation because of their inherent creative power. This changed gradually as brewing became more commercialized and regulated. As beer production moved from households to large-scale breweries, men increasingly took control. Religious changes that diminished goddess worship also reduced women's brewing authority. By the medieval period in Europe, brewing guilds often excluded women, though they continued illegal or small-scale brewing. The echoes of women's brewing dominance persisted. Alewives in medieval England were women who brewed and sold ale from their homes. The pointed hat associated with witches may derive from the tall hats worn by alewives to be visible in markets. The association between women, brewing, and witchcraft reflects ancient fears about women's power over fermentation and transformation, beer, and the development of writing. The administrative needs of beer production and distribution played a crucial role in the development of writing systems. Some of the earliest written documents are beer-related, and the vocabulary around brewing appears in the first dictionaries. Sumerian cuneiform, one of the world's first writing systems, contains extensive beer terminology from its earliest stages. The pictogram for beer, a jar with pointed bottom, appears in texts from 3200 BCE. Early tablets record beer rations, brewing ingredients, and distribution lists. The complexity of managing beer production for large populations required record-keeping that pushed writing development. The evolution of beer-related writing shows increasing sophistication. Early pictograms simply indicated beer. Later texts distinguished between types of beer, quality grades, and production stages. Mathematical notation developed partly to calculate beer rations and brewing ratios. Some scholars argue that the need to record brewing recipes drove the development of instructional writing. The determinative for beer appears in hundreds of words. Brewing terminology was so developed that different words existed for beer at various fermentation stages, different strengths, and different ingredients. The ability to read and write brewing instructions became a valuable skill that could ensure employment. Administrative texts reveal the bureaucracy of beer. Tax records show beer taxation systems. Legal documents record beer-related disputes. Work contracts specify beer payments. These mundane documents provide invaluable insights into daily life and economic systems. Without beer's economic importance, much of this documentation wouldn't exist. The standardization of measurements began with beer. The need to ensure fair beer rations led to standardized volumes. The Sumerian sealer, about 1 liter, was primarily a beer measure. Egyptian hikat measurements were used for grain and beer. These standardized measurements were essential for trade, taxation, and wage payment. The religious revolution of beer. Beer's role in ancient religion went beyond mere offering or celebration. It fundamentally shaped how humans understood divinity, transformation, and the sacred. The mysterious process of fermentation became a model for understanding death, rebirth, and divine intervention. Fermentation was inexplicable magic to ancient peoples. Clear, sweet liquid became cloudy, then cleared again as something entirely different. It bubbled as if alive, generated warmth without fire, and created psychoactive effects that seemed to open doorways to other realms. This transformation became a metaphor for spiritual transformation. The cycle of brewing paralleled agricultural and cosmic cycles. Grain died in the earth and was reborn. It died again in malting and was reborn in beer. This death-rebirth cycle connected brewing to mystery religions focused on resurrection and eternal life. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, and other dying rising gods were associated with fermented beverages. Communal intoxication created shared religious experiences. The altered state produced by alcohol was interpreted as divine possession or communion with gods. Group drinking in. This shared transcendence bonded religious communities and validated spiritual beliefs. The preparation of ritual beer was itself religious practice. Every step from grain selection to fermentation was ritualized. Prayers accompanied each action. Offerings were made to ensure successful fermentation. The brewery became a temple, the brewer a priest, the fermentation vessel an altar where transformation occurred. Different beers for different gods reflected theological complexity. Just as gods had different personalities and powers, their preferred beers varied. Warrior gods received strong beer. Fertility goddesses got sweet beer. Underworld deities were offered dark beer. This differentiation shows sophisticated theological thinking about divine preferences and characteristics. Conclusion: the eternal human connection to beer. As we've journeyed through the ancient history of beer, from the hymn to Ninkasi to the pyramid builders' rations, we've seen that beer is far more than just an alcoholic beverage. It's one of humanity's oldest biotechnologies, a cornerstone of civilization, and a thread that connects us directly to our earliest ancestors. The story of ancient beer is really the story of human ingenuity and adaptation. Without understanding the science, ancient peoples mastered complex biochemical processes. They developed techniques that we still use today, created quality control systems that rival modern standards, and built entire economies around fermented grain. Their achievements become more, not less, impressive when we understand the science behind them. Beer shaped civilization in ways we're only beginning to understand. It may have motivated agriculture, certainly facilitated urbanization, and definitely influenced the development of writing, mathematics, and trade. The need to produce and distribute beer created administrative structures that evolved into governments. The social bonds formed over shared beer helped hold early societies together. The pyramid builders who received their daily beer rations weren't just being paid, they were participating in an economic and social system that had developed over millennia. That beer represented agriculture, technology, administration, and culture, all fermented together, each jar. The religious and spiritual dimensions of ancient beer remind us that fermentation was humanity's first encounter with controlled transformation. Before we could forge metal or fire pottery, we could transform grain into beer. This mysterious process became a model for understanding all transformation: biological, spiritual, and social. The role of women in ancient brewing tells a story of expertise and authority that was later suppressed and forgotten. The female brewers of Mesopotamia and Egypt weren't just making drinks. They were practicing biotechnology, running businesses, and maintaining cultural traditions. Their erasure from brewing history reflects broader patterns of women's contributions being minimized or forgotten. Today, as craft brewing experiences a renaissance and ancient beer styles are being recreated, we're reconnecting with this deep history. Modern brewers studying ancient techniques aren't just novelty-seeking. They're rediscovering knowledge that was nearly lost. The sour beers now trending in craft brewing would be immediately familiar to ancient brewers. The emphasis on local ingredients and traditional methods echoes ancient practices. But perhaps the most important lesson from ancient beer is about human nature itself. Across cultures, continents, and millennia, humans have gathered to share fermented beverages. The desire to transform grain into beer seems almost hardwired into our species. The social bonding that occurs over shared drinks is universal. The joy of intoxication, the comfort of tradition, the celebration of abundance, these are constants in human experience. When we raise a glass of beer today, we're participating in a tradition that stretches back to before written history. The basic process, malting grain, extracting sugars, fermenting with yeast, remains unchanged since someone first discovered it, probably by accident, in the Neolithic period. The equipment is fancier, the science is understood, but the fundamental transformation is the same. The ancient brewers we've met, the Sumerian priestesses singing to Ninkasi, the Egyptian workers supplying pyramid builders, the women running taverns in Ur, weren't so different from us. They worried about quality, experimented with flavors, dealt with failed batches, and celebrated successes. They gathered with friends over beer, used it to mark celebrations and mourning, and passed their knowledge to the next generation. The need for safe, nutritious beverages, the desire for mild intoxication and social lubrication, the joy of sharing special foods and drinks with our community, the satisfaction of transforming raw ingredients into something greater. These drives shaped ancient civilizations and continue to shape our world today. As we face modern challenges, industrial food systems, loss of traditional knowledge, social isolation, ancient beer offers lessons. It shows us the value of local production, traditional techniques, and communal consumption. It reminds us that food and drink are never just about nutrition, but always about culture, community, and meaning. The next time you drink a beer, take a moment to consider its deep history. That simple beverage connects you to pyramid builders and Sumerian priestesses, to Viking warriors and medieval monks, to countless generations who knew that transforming grain into beer was a kind of everyday magic worth celebrating. Remember that beer was currency before there was money, medicine before there were doctors, and a social network before there was internet. It built pyramids, funded temples, and facilitated the spread of agriculture and civilization. It was payment, pleasure, and prayer, all fermented together. And remember, too, that every innovation in brewing, from the discovery of malting to the isolation of yeast strains, came from someone paying attention, experimenting, and sharing knowledge. The history of beer is the history of human curiosity and cooperation, of tradition and innovation in balance. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the afterlife they would drink beer with the gods in the field of reeds. The Sumerians saw beer as a gift from divine Ninkasi. The Vikings expected to drink ale in Valhalla. Across cultures, The perfect afterlife included perfect beer. This tells us something profound about how humans have always viewed beer. Not as mere alcohol, but as one of life's genuine pleasures, worthy of eternal continuation. Today's brewers, whether in gleaming industrial facilities or garage nano-breweries, are inheritors of this ancient tradition. Every batch they brew adds to a story that began before. They're not just making a product, they're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most essential cultural practices. So here's to beer, to its ancient past and continuing future, to the forgotten brewers who developed techniques we still use, to the workers who built pyramids on beer rations, to everyone who has ever transformed grain into liquid gold. The story of beer is the story of humanity itself, creative, social, transformative, and always looking for the next round. The hymn to Ninkasi still echoes every time a brewer checks their fermentation. The pyramid builder's daily ration lives on in every shift beer at a modern brewery. The ancient tradition of communal drinking continues in every pub, beer garden, and brewery taproom. We are all part of this great fermentation, this transformation of grain and water into something that has always been more than the sum of its parts. Beer, it turns out, isn't just history. It's the liquid that flows through history, connecting us all in an unbroken stream of grain, water, yeast, and human ingenuity. From Ninkasi to your local brewery, from pyramid builders to modern construction workers, from ancient taverns to today's craft beer bars. The story continues, one glass at a time.